Today we will be looking at painting. Now Photoshop has a whole variety of brushes that you can use and access. You can also create your own brushes and save brush libraries or access someone else's brush library and install it into your Photoshop brushes panel. When you select the brush tool, and I'll move the toolbar over so you can see it really clearly, we've got the brush tool, which I've selected, and you can see that I have my background layer available. I can create a new layer to paint on, and because I've got a foreground and background color picked, you can see that there's a light beige. I can go in and select from my swatches the color that I'd like to paint with, and take a look at the control bar. It's telling me that I have a brush selected. My brush is 90 pixels wide. If I click on the drop down, you can see that I can access brushes from this drop down menu. These certainly aren't all of the brushes that are available in Photoshop, and of course I have some of my own brushes in here installed that I've created with paint daubs, photographs, etc. So your window will not look the same as mine, but you can see for the typical brushes, the default brushes, I can click on a brush and you can see that I have 90 pixel brush selected. This is the size slider, so I can make the brush larger or smaller, or type in a size. I can make the hardness of the brush, or the outside area of the brush, less hard or 100% hard. So you can see I have a hard round brush. I can, with the slider, make the brush a little bit larger, and you can see when I'm floating over my canvas it is getting larger. If I paint with that brush, you can see it has a hard edge, and I can paint with the brush and it is definitely an ellipse with a hard edge that is being cloned over and over and over again. So you can see sort of the rounded edges. If I go back to my brush drop down, you can see that a softer brush with zero hardness, it's going to look a little bit different, even though it is pretty much the same size. I can make the brush stroke, and you can see the edge is not hard, and it's going to paint a little bit more smoothly, right? Pretty straightforward. I'm going to take that layer and just drop it into the trash and create a new layer. So I always want to paint on a new layer. I like to keep all of my layers separate so that I can use adjustment layers on the separate layers, or use a multiply blend mode on the paint that I'm applying. And I like to keep it separate because in the real world when I'm painting, it's really difficult to peel paint off the bottom layer, like the canvas or the watercolor paper. But in Photoshop, I can eliminate, erase, move, rotate, duplicate anything I want to because of these awesome layers. So back to that brushes drop down. In Photoshop, we've got brushes that are the typical brushes, the round brush heads, and we also have brushes that are real media brushes. They actually look like, when you click on them, they do look like the brush variety that you would see in the real world. So I have a brush selected, and this is a bristle brush. It works the absolute best with a Wacom tablet or a Cintiq tablet. You can use them with the mouse. It's just that you don't have the variety of the speed, rotation, and the pressure that you do with a tablet. In any case, I've got my brush selected, I've got my color selected, and I've got the opacity at 100%, I've got the mode at normal, and the flow at 100%, and this is what my brush looks like. Awesome! Awesome! Beautiful brush, okay? Interesting, if I were using a stylus, the pressure that I put on the stylus is going to register on the brush stroke. So it's like using a bristle brush in this case that has long tines or bristles, and if I'm pressing in the center of that paint stroke, it's going to get wider and it's going to release more paint. This is such a cool thing about using a tablet, is that you can rotate your wrist, add pressure, and the quickness of the stroke is going to register on that brush stroke. When I go up to that drop down again and show you some of the other brushes that are available, we've got some typical default brushes that look like sponges, they look like splatters. So I've just selected a sponge brush, Command Z, I'll just Z out. I'm just gonna drop this layer into the trash and create a new layer. When I'm floating over my screen, I can see that this is a pretty small brush. It's 63 pixels wide. If I press Command bracket, oh sorry, just the bracket key, it makes the brush larger. And here we are with one daub of that sponge. And you can see if I click and keep daubing, I am adding more of that sponge. If I add a multiply or color burn, wherever I'm clicking and I'm daubing, that is showing up as the blue, and wherever there is paint below it on that layer, it is adding multiply to it, so it's darkening up. If I simply click and drag, it's showing me that that sponge is now being cloned over and over again on that stroke. It's pretty cool because it has a really nice kind of grungy, distressed outline. So again, you can paint with mode. So if I'm painting with soft light, it's going to lighten up whatever I've painted on. And depending on what color I'm using, that is what's going to happen. So the paint mode, layer mode, is going to add to whatever you are using in or on that layer. It's not really a layer blend, it's a mode or a blend mode for the brush. So you can see that I have everything on layer 1. Not the best choice. So if I click and I start painting my strokes, and you can see that I have difference on, let's turn that off and click on multiply, create another layer, use a different color, and start painting. And you can see what's happening to the strokes below. And now I've just covered everything up. I can still maintain the paint daubs that I've painted on layer 1, even though I have layer 2 in front of it. Okay. I can move my paint strokes. I can apply a layer mode. Let's see what's happening here. To change how those strokes are reacting with each other. I can do anything with these paint strokes. I can press Command T to rotate them, make them larger. Very interesting. So painting, keeping your layers separate, painting with the various brush heads, changing the opacity, changing the blend modes of the brush stroke, using the separate layers again, using opacity. Here's the opacity of the brush, so I can paint with a lower opacity brush, and I'll create a new layer. I'll leave it on normal, and to show you what's happening here. So I've got now a full 36% normal brush painted onto layer 3. Layer 3 has an opacity of 100%. There is no blend mode on it, but if I use multiply, it's going to darken up only where those brush strokes are, the layer below. So it's very interesting, all of the different options that you have in Photoshop while painting with these brushes. So I'll go back, select a brush again, and go to the drop-down menu and just show you some of the brushes that I've created, and some of them I've downloaded and some of them I've made with real paint strokes. So here is a brush that has a lot of characteristics that you would find in a regular paint stroke, and you can see this brush was a scanned brush. Okay, when I select it, it's 211 pixels large. If I make the brush a little bit bigger, you can see the brush is getting larger. This is the paint stroke that I get when the brush is painted with 36%, so I'll just up that to 100. If I make that paint daub bigger by pressing the bracket key, you can see the different kinds of qualities of this brush. It's got some paint splatters, it's got some tints in there, so tints that are darker and lighter than the color that I've chosen. If I select another color, you'll see that I've got a lot of interesting variety in this brush. I can make it larger and smaller on the fly, change my paint color, paint stroke. So I'm adding, and right now I'm just clicking those paint daubs on the screen. Create a new layer, turn that one off, and just paint with that brush. You can see that that is a cloned brush. It is a brush that was created with real paint on a piece of paper, scanned in and brought into Photoshop. I made a selection of that bunch of paint daubs and I turned it into a brush. The brush itself can be rotated. If you open up the brushes panel, the brushes panel gives you this beautiful little button, or sort of a control wheel that will allow you to change the direction that that brush is facing, or the roundness of the brush. So close this up for a minute. And to show you on a new layer, turn that one off. So what I've done is I've rotated that brush head, and now I can paint with it on a different angle with a rotation. I'm going to open that brushes panel up again and set that back to 100%. I can change the spacing, so you can see when I'm painting with a clone, it's going to give me a brush clone, a brush head clone on that brush at whatever angle. I can flip it if I'd like. If I press multiply, you'll see that those brush strokes or clones can be used. So one brush can look like many different styles just by flipping or rotating the angle, changing the roundness and spacing of that brush. There are way more shape dynamics, scattering, texture, dual brush, color dynamics, transfer, smoothing, all included. All of these options are included for every single brush that you can choose. So if I choose a new brush, it's going to show me what that brush will look like if I click and I pull along a paint stroke. So if I open up a new layer to paint on, I've got my brush, I have one daub. If I press the bracket key, I'm going to be making that brush stroke larger. So there's my brush stroke. The stroke, not really a stroke, it's a daub. If I paint and create a stroke, you can see that this is a group of duplicates. Command Z gets rid of them. Open up that brushes panel again and change the rotation. Whoops. Change the rotation of that brush. I can change from multiply to any other mode. I can change my color of the brush. And I'll go back to the layers panel to show you the layers panel. These brushes were created, the last ones that I've been using were created with a digital image. It can be an image that you scan in or you create in Photoshop, or that you navigate to in a Google image search. However you get an image into Photoshop is up to you. You can create a brush out of any digital pixelated image, absolutely any. I can create a brush out of what I have made on the screen. That's pretty spectacular. So I'll just turn on all the layers and see what I've gotten here. Let's see. Kind of interesting. Let's say I wanted to make a brush that looked like this. I can go in to my selection tool. So I've got a marquee that is a square or a rectangle, and I've selected it. If I make a selection, so I've made a nice big square on my screen of my layers that I've created with my brushes. If I go to edit, Define brush preset, it's as simple as that. Define brush preset is going to show me what my brush looks like. It's going to tell me how large my brush is, and it's going to name the brush for me. As soon as I say OK, that brush is going to be added. If I select the brush tool, it's going to be added as the very last brush. Very, very, very simple. So brushes. Brushes can be created with Photoshop, pixelated documents, with photographs, with scans. They can be created photographs of anything. So brush daubs or hair, toast, photographs of people's faces, flowers, brocade textures, any kind of texture that you want to paint with, you can scan in or take a photograph of and bring it into Photoshop. And you need to make a selection. It does not have to be a square. It can be a organic shape. I'm just going to go back into Photoshop, into the layers panel, and show you what my brush looks like. So I'll turn off all of those layers, deselect, Command D, and open up a new layer to paint on, and you can see my brush is ready to go. And if I click, my brush is now a square. In creating brushes for Photoshop or painting with Photoshop, the areas that are white will be invisible. They won't pick up paint. The darker the scan, the more paint is picked up by the brush. So you have from black to white, almost like masking. Black is going to, though, give you the paint. White is going to give you no paint. And every shade of gray in between for your brushes is going to give you varying opacities of paint. So my brush was almost a 2000 pixel wide brush if I press the bracket key to make it smaller. So we've got the left and right bracket key. The left hand one makes the brush smaller, the right hand one makes the brush larger. And those are the brackets that are on the keypad right beside the P. So you can see I've made a brush and I'm making the stroke of the brush. And you can see how maybe effective this could be, maybe not. If I take a look at that brush, I'll pull it up and pull it up in the brushes panel. You can see that the brush, when it is scattered the way that it is spaced, it's giving me the clone. And you can see how effective a square brush is going to be. Not so much unless you're just clicking and plastering that, that clone as one daub. When I go to a more brush-like or paint daub type brush, you can see how the stroke is going to be applied along a stroke. Okay, some of them are better to use and some of them just look like real brushes when you click and drag them, and some actually work better when you're applying them as a paint daub. Let's go back to these guys. These guys are super fun. So I'm going to grab this brush. It looks like drippy paint. So that's a great example of a brush that probably looks better if you apply it as paint daubs instead of just straight painting with it. So brushes. You can create a brush with a paint daub that you use real paint on paper, and you scan this in and you make a selection of it in Photoshop as long as the area around the paint daub is pure white. So we'll get an example, or we'll do an example of that in the next film or in the next video. I don't want to go too far right now, but just to, I'll deselect, just to give you a little intro into brush making and brush use. There are the two panels. We've got the brush panel. The brush panel is where you would navigate to when you select the brush. You'd navigate here to change the angle of the brush, the roundness, shape dynamics, and you can see that you can add angle jitter, roundness jitter, and that's going to show you how that brush is going to react when you paint with it on strokes, long strokes. Scattering. Scattering is going to add a number of scatters of that brush. And you can see that the scatter has been updated. When you click on or off some of these options, you will be adding the options, but you will not be fully seeing what that panel looks like. So right now I'm moving to texture. Texture can be applied to the brush. So you can see that I'm painting with a texture now. Very interesting. It's a patterned texture. So a patterned texture can be brought into Photoshop by doing the same thing as I did with creating the brush, making a selection on a scanned in image or a Photoshop document that you've created or a photograph of anything. You have to make a square selection, however, for that pattern to work. So what does that mean? If I go in with my rectangle tool or my rectangular marquee tool and I simply click and I press shift while I'm clicking to make a perfect square, and you can see, I'll zoom in slightly, use my hand and move over, that is a perfect square. If I go to edit, define pattern, it will show me the pattern. It names the pattern, and of course you can name your patterns if you want to. You can see there's a input. I say OK, and now that pattern is going to be added to the Command D to the pattern dropdown right here. So whenever you create a new brush or create a new pattern, it will be the last element that is selectable in the brush panel or in the brush dropdown. So this is my last brush, this is my last pattern that I've made. We also, when we make patterns, if I go back to the layers panel, if I want to go to create new fill or adjustment layer and I navigate to pattern, my pattern is going to be brought in to the pattern fill area. So this is my pattern, and you can see how effective it is because I did select a little bit of that paint stroke instead of just the pattern. And it's not really a perfect pattern for tiling anyway because it doesn't tile properly. So I wouldn't really necessarily want to use a pattern that I made on a whole fill or adjustment layer. And I'll show you some of the patterns that I've created for different kinds of illustrations. So I've got a bunch of different patterns here, and some of these patterns are in Photoshop. So these can be used as pattern options on your brush, and they can also be used as full fill or adjustment layers. I'll just cancel out there. So patterns, if I go back to the brush, open up the brush panel, you can see that I can add the pattern of the brush to the brush, and therefore making that brush even a little bit more exciting, more interesting. So patterns can be added to the brush. Dual brush, you can have dual brush heads all working at once. You can have color dynamics, hue, jittering the hue, and saturation and brightness, and that's going to add color to the brush, tints and shades to the brush. We've got brush pose, we've got noise, we can add noise to our brushes, go in, wet edges to the brush, so the options are really limitless, and it does depend on what kind of painting you intend on doing. And for this assignment, I'd really like you guys to either create a hand-drawn sketch or navigate through a Google image search to coloring book or something like that, like a hand-drawn sketch or a coloring book image, and just start painting. Try and paint your hand-drawn sketch and create an illustration, a colored illustration from it. And I'll just stop this video now, and then for the next one I'll move on to creating brushes and using wet brushes, wet media brushes. So I'm going to stop the video.